Socrates, often regarded as one of the greatest philosophers of all time, remains a central figure in the history of Western thought. Born in Athens in the 5th century BCE, he is credited with laying the foundations for much of modern philosophy. His unique approach to understanding the world, centered on ethical inquiry and rational debate, set him apart from his contemporaries. Socrates never wrote down his teachings, so most of what we know about him comes from the accounts of his disciples, primarily Plato and Xenophon. Through their works, we are able to glimpse the mind of a philosopher who questioned the very nature of existence, morality, and knowledge. Despite his significant impact on intellectual thought, Socrates himself remained largely uninterested in fame or material success. He did not seek to establish a formal school or write philosophical treatises. Instead, he dedicated his life to engaging in dialogue with the citizens of Athens, encouraging them to think critically about their beliefs and assumptions. This method, now known as the Socratic method, involved asking probing questions designed to reveal contradictions in his interlocutors' thinking and lead them toward a deeper understanding of themselves and the world around them. One of the most striking aspects of Socrates' philosophy was his belief that knowledge and virtue were deeply interconnected. He argued that the key to living a virtuous life was understanding what virtue truly meant and cultivating the knowledge that guided ethical action. This quest for self-understanding and moral clarity was at the heart of his life's work. Socrates viewed wisdom not as the possession of answers, but as the ability to ask the right questions, an approach that challenged the more traditional views of knowledge prevalent in his time. Socrates' contributions to philosophy were not just intellectual, they were also political. Living in a democracy, he often questioned the nature of authority and power, urging Athenians to reflect on their society's values and actions. His teachings called into question the legitimacy of many of the social norms and political structures that governed Athenian life. This, in turn, made him a controversial figure, especially among the political elite, who saw his influence as a threat to their established order. Throughout his life, Socrates engaged with a wide range of people, from common citizens to prominent statesmen. He is said to have spent much of his time in the Agora, the public square of Athens, where he would initiate conversations with anyone willing to engage in dialogue. His characteristic method of questioning often left his interlocutors feeling uncomfortable or exposed, yet Socrates himself claimed to know little about the answers to the questions he posed. His humility in acknowledging his own ignorance was one of his defining traits, encapsulated in the famous phrase attributed to him, "I know that I am intelligent, because I know that I know nothing." Despite his modest lifestyle and lack of formal recognition, Socrates' intellectual influence was profound. He was not just a teacher, but also a critic of the prevailing philosophical systems of his time. Unlike the sophists, who were known for their relativistic views and emphasis on rhetorical skill, Socrates held that truth was objective and could be discovered through reasoned inquiry. This stark contrast made him both an advocate for critical thinking and a foe of the prevailing rhetorical practices that prioritize persuasion over truth. Socrates' approach to philosophy was also deeply ethical. While many philosophers before him had concerned themselves with cosmology and metaphysics, Socrates focused on questions about how to live a good life. His focus on ethics set him apart from the pre-Socratics, who were more concerned with the nature of the universe. Socrates argued that understanding the nature of humanity and the moral framework for human action should take precedence over abstract inquiries into the physical world. His insistence on the importance of ethics and virtue, however, made him a polarizing figure. While many of his followers admired him for his commitment to truth and virtue, others saw his ideas as subversive. His critique of the Athenian political system and his disregard for the traditional gods of the city placed him at odds with influential members of society. Socrates' growing influence in Athens eventually led to the charges that would result in his trial and execution. The trial of Socrates, which occurred in 399 BCE, was a pivotal moment in both his life and the history of philosophy. Accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety, refusing to honor the gods of the state, Socrates was sentenced to death by hemlock. His defense, as recorded in Plato's Apology, reveals much about his character. Socrates faced his death with remarkable composure, demonstrating his commitment to his principles even in the face of mortal danger. His death marked the end of an era for Athenian philosophy, but also solidified his place in history as a martyr for reason and intellectual inquiry. Socrates' life and teachings had an immeasurable impact on the development of Western philosophy. His methods and ideas influenced generations of philosophers, most notably his student Plato, who would go on to shape the course of philosophical thought for centuries to come. Through the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other later thinkers, Socrates' influence has been felt across millennia, making him a foundational figure in the history of human thought. His legacy continues to resonate today, as his method of critical inquiry and his commitment to virtue remain central to modern philosophical and ethical discussions. In conclusion, Socrates' life is a testament to the power of questioning, humility, and intellectual integrity. His refusal to accept conventional wisdom, his dedication to seeking truth, and his commitment to living an examined life have left an indelible mark on the intellectual landscape of the West. While his life was cut short, Socrates' philosophical contributions live on, inspiring countless generations to think critically and live virtuously. To understand Socrates and his philosophy, it is crucial to consider the historical and social context of ancient Athens during the 5th century BCE. Athens, at the time, was one of the most prominent and powerful city-states in Greece. Known for its intellectual and cultural achievements, Athens became the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and the arts. However, this period of intellectual flourishing was also marked by social, political, and military upheaval, all of which shaped Socrates' views and provided the backdrop for his life's work. At the heart of Athenian society was its unique system of democracy, which was established in the early 5th century BCE under the leadership of Cleisthenes. The Athenian democracy was radical for its time, as it allowed all male citizens to participate directly in the political process, such as voting in the assembly and serving on juries. This system, while groundbreaking in promoting political equality, was also inherently unstable, with the whims of the people often leading to dramatic and sometimes irrational decisions. It is within this democracy that Socrates lived, interacted, and eventually became a critic. Athens in the 5th century BCE was also a center of cultural and intellectual activity. The city boasted a flourishing art scene, with playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides and sculptors like Phidias producing some of the most revered works of antiquity. The intellectual landscape was dominated by philosophers such as Pythagoras and Heraclitus, who had laid the groundwork for metaphysical and ethical inquiry. However, as Athens' political power grew, so did the prominence of intellectual movements such as the Sophists, who began to gain influence. The Sophists, traveling teachers who taught rhetoric and virtue, argued that truth was relative and that persuasive speech was the key to success in public life. Their relativistic views on truth and morality stood in stark contrast to Socrates' belief in objective knowledge and virtue, which led to his eventual confrontation with the prevailing intellectual currents of his time. The Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 431 to 404 BCE, was another critical event that shaped the atmosphere of Athens during Socrates' life. This protracted conflict between Athens and Sparta, along with their respective allies, took a tremendous toll on Athenian society. The war led to widespread social and political instability, economic hardship, and a breakdown in civic pride. The final defeat of Athens in 404 BC was a blow to the city's democratic ideals and its position as the leading power in Greece. It was during these turbulent times that Socrates emerged as a figure of moral and intellectual integrity, often challenging the assumptions of both the democratic government and the political elites. In the wake of Athens' defeat in the Peloponnesian War, the city's political system faced significant challenges. The brief reign of the 30 Tyrants, an oligarchic government backed by Sparta, intensified the social and political divisions within the city. Socrates, who was known for his associations with many prominent individuals of the oligarchic faction, including Critias and Alcibiades, was sometimes viewed with suspicion. His critical attitude toward the democratic system and his willingness to associate with figures who had been involved in the tyrannical government led some to question his loyalty to Athens and its values. These suspicions would later contribute to the charges brought against him during his trial. The social structure of Athens also had a profound impact on Socrates' views. While Athens was home to a thriving middle class of citizens, the majority of the population, about 1/3, were slaves. Slavery was a common institution throughout the Greek world, and Athenian society was deeply dependent on slave labor for its economic prosperity. Although Socrates does not appear to have explicitly addressed the issue of slavery in his teachings, the institution was a significant part of the world he inhabited. His ethical philosophy, focused on individual virtue and the pursuit of knowledge, implicitly challenged the moral justifications for such practices, especially as he emphasized the importance of self-examination and moral responsibility. In contrast to the ideal of Athenian democracy, the intellectual environment of Athens was also characterized by a tension between free speech and political expediency. The democratic system allowed for public debate and the expression of ideas, yet it also exposed individuals to the dangers of political and social retribution. Socrates' practice of questioning widely held beliefs, challenging the status quo, and refusing to accept conventional wisdom made him a polarizing figure in Athens. Many viewed him as a gadfly, irritating the political and intellectual elites, while others admired him for his dedication to truth and virtue. His refusal to conform to the norms of Athenian society, along with his uncompromising pursuit of wisdom, made him an outsider in his own city. Another important aspect of Athenian society that influenced Socrates was the city's religious beliefs. Athens was a deeply religious society, and the gods played a central role in public and private life. The city's polytheistic religion, with its pantheon of gods and goddesses, provided a moral framework for its citizens. However, Socrates' personal religious beliefs were unconventional. He was often criticized for his lack of respect for the traditional gods and for introducing new divinities. His claim to be guided by a divine inner voice, or daimonion, which directed his actions and decisions, was seen by some as an affront to the established religious order. This conflict between Socrates and the religious establishment would become one of the central issues during his trial. Despite the challenges posed by the political, social, and religious environment of Athens, Socrates' intellectual contributions were profound. His method of questioning and critical inquiry transcended the conventional norms of the time, and his emphasis on ethics and the pursuit of knowledge helped lay the foundation for Western philosophy. In a society where truth was often viewed as relative, Socrates held fast to the belief that there was an objective truth to be discovered through reason and dialogue. His philosophy, deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of Athens, served as both a critique of and a challenge to the prevailing norms of his day. In conclusion, the historical and social context of Athens during the 5th century BCE provides essential insight into Socrates' philosophy and the challenges he faced. The city's democratic system, its intellectual environment, and the social upheavals of the Peloponnesian War all played a significant role in shaping the philosophical questions that Socrates pursued. His life and teachings were not only a response to these historical conditions, but also a challenge to the very foundations of Athenian society. Understanding the context of Socrates' time allows us to appreciate the revolutionary nature of his ideas and the profound impact he had on the course of philosophy. The life of Socrates is often considered enigmatic due to the lack of primary sources detailing his early years. What we know about his early life comes primarily from the accounts of his students, most notably Plato and Xenophon, as well as from references in the works of other contemporary thinkers. While much of the information is speculative, it is still possible to outline the key elements of Socrates' upbringing and education that shaped his intellectual development. Understanding Socrates' early life is essential to grasp the profound philosophical transformations he would later inspire in Athenian society. Socrates was born around 470 BCE, during a period of great cultural and political change in Athens. His father, Sophroniscus, was a sculptor, and his mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife. The humble background of Socrates may have contributed to his later indifference to wealth and social status. Unlike many of his philosophical contemporaries, Socrates did not come from an aristocratic or elite family. His upbringing, marked by modest means, provided him with a unique perspective on the world, one that was not tainted by the privilege or political ambitions of the Athenian aristocracy. Although Socrates' early life is largely unknown, it is likely that he received a standard education for a male citizen in Athens. This would have included basic literacy and an introduction to subjects such as music, poetry, and physical training. Athenian education was primarily designed to prepare young men for civic participation, with an emphasis on the development of virtue and good character. However, it was in the sphere of intellectual inquiry that Socrates would eventually distinguish himself. His early exposure to the philosophical ideas of the time played a crucial role in shaping his later thinking. Socrates' intellectual education was significantly influenced by the great thinkers of his era. During his youth, Athens was home to a number of prominent intellectual figures, and Socrates likely encountered their ideas during his early years. One such figure was the philosopher Anaxagoras, whose naturalistic explanations of the universe had a profound influence on Athenian intellectual life. Anaxagoras introduced the idea that the universe was governed by rational principles, a notion that would resonate with Socrates' later emphasis on reason and knowledge. It is also possible that Socrates encountered the teachings of the Pythagoreans, who emphasized the importance of numbers and mathematical harmony, and the Sophists, who championed rhetoric and the power of persuasive speech. The influence of the Sophists on Socrates is particularly notable, as they represented a significant intellectual movement that challenged traditional views of knowledge and morality. The Sophists were itinerant teachers who taught their students to argue effectively and persuade others, regardless of the truth of their positions. Their relativistic approach to truth and ethics, which denied the existence of absolute moral standards, stood in stark contrast to Socrates' belief in objective knowledge and virtue. Socrates engaged with the Sophists, but he was highly critical of their methods, particularly their focus on practical success and the manipulation of language. His philosophical opposition to the Sophists would later become one of the central themes in his intellectual career. Socrates was also deeply influenced by his interactions with the Athenian political and social life. While many philosophers of his time were concerned with metaphysical questions about the nature of the universe, Socrates was more focused on questions of ethics and human behavior. His interest in the human soul and its development led him to explore issues such as virtue, justice, and the nature of the good life. Unlike the pre-Socratic philosophers, who were concerned with the cosmos, Socrates believed that philosophy should be concerned with the improvement of the individual and the betterment of society. This shift in focus was revolutionary, as it marked the beginning of ethical philosophy as a central concern for Western thought. Socrates' own personal development as a philosopher is also linked to his experiences as a soldier. Socrates served as a hoplite, a heavily armed infantryman, in several military campaigns, including the Battle of Potidaea, the Battle of Delium, and the Battle of Amphipolis. These experiences, which took place over the course of many years, may have had a profound impact on his views about courage, duty, and the nature of the good life. The stories of Socrates' bravery and resilience on the battlefield, where he reportedly saved the life of Alcibiades and fought with great endurance, suggest that his philosophical views were grounded in a deep sense of personal virtue. His experiences as a soldier likely reinforced his belief in the importance of living a virtuous life, even in the face of danger and adversity. Socrates' early years were also marked by a deep engagement with the arts. While not known as a practitioner of the arts himself, Socrates was deeply interested in the works of others, particularly in the field of poetry. He often engaged in discussions with poets and artists, questioning them about the nature of beauty, creativity, and inspiration. His critical stance toward poetry was informed by his belief that artistic works should serve a moral purpose, contributing to the cultivation of virtue and the improvement of the soul. Socrates' engagement with the arts reflects his broader view that all areas of human life, including culture and education, should be directed toward the development of the soul. Despite his intellectual development, Socrates was not interested in pursuing wealth, fame, or public office. He remained committed to his role as a philosopher, engaging with those around him in public debates and dialogues. His lifestyle was frugal, and he did not seek the approval or material rewards that came with public recognition. This dedication to philosophy over personal gain marked him as a distinctive figure in Athenian society. Socrates' lack of concern for material wealth and political power would become a defining feature of his philosophy, one that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. The beginning of Socrates' philosophical career was also marked by his decision to forego a formal teaching method. Unlike the sophists, who charged fees for their instruction, Socrates did not operate a school or accept money for his philosophical activities. His method was informal and public, engaging anyone who was willing to converse with him in the marketplace or other public spaces. This lack of formal structure allowed Socrates to remain independent, free from the influence of wealth or political power, and committed solely to the pursuit of truth and moral understanding. In conclusion, Socrates' early life and education played a crucial role in shaping his philosophical outlook. His modest background, early intellectual influences, military experiences, and engagement with Athenian society all contributed to the development of his ideas. Socrates' focus on ethics, his rejection of material wealth, and his commitment to the improvement of the soul were deeply rooted in his early experiences. By examining Socrates' formative years, we can better understand the philosophical journey that led him to become one of the most influential figures in the history of Western thought. The Socratic method stands as one of Socrates' most enduring contributions to philosophy. This distinctive approach to inquiry and dialogue has not only shaped the development of Western thought, but has also influenced countless fields, from law to education. The method is characterized by its emphasis on questioning, critical thinking, and a deep commitment to uncovering contradictions in beliefs. In essence, the Socratic method is a tool designed to stimulate reflection, encourage self-examination, and lead to a clearer understanding of fundamental truths. Socrates' use of this method marks a revolution in thinking, as it radically shifted the focus of philosophy from abstract speculation about the cosmos to a more practical examination of human existence. At its core, the Socratic method involves asking a series of probing questions to expose inconsistencies in a person's beliefs and to guide them toward a more refined understanding of their own ideas. Socrates believed that knowledge was not a matter of memorizing facts or accepting authoritative opinions, but rather, it was the product of active, rigorous questioning. This process often began with a simple question or proposition, followed by further questions that sought to clarify, challenge, and probe the initial response. Through this series of inquiries, Socrates aimed to lead his interlocutor to a deeper understanding, often demonstrating that their initial belief was flawed or incomplete. Socrates himself famously claimed to know nothing, adopting a stance of intellectual humility that was central to his method. By declaring his own ignorance, Socrates created an egalitarian space for dialogue, where all participants, regardless of social status or education, could engage in the process of philosophical inquiry. This approach stands in stark contrast to the authoritarian methods of teaching used by other intellectual figures of the time, such as the sophists, who claimed to possess certain knowledge and offered it to their students for a fee. Socrates, by contrast, saw his role as one of guiding others to discover truths for themselves, rather than merely imparting knowledge. The method's effectiveness lies in its ability to engage participants in a dynamic and collaborative search for truth. Socrates did not believe that he held all the answers, nor did he aim to provide simple solutions to complex problems. Instead, he believed that by questioning and engaging in dialogue, individuals could arrive at a deeper, more nuanced understanding of ethical concepts such as justice, virtue, and knowledge. This process of questioning was not meant to lead to a final, absolute answer, but rather to stimulate continuous reflection and refinement of ideas. The Socratic method is often described as a form of dialectical reasoning, a back-and-forth exchange that involves testing and refining ideas through conversation. It is through dialectic that Socrates sought to uncover universal truths about human life and morality. In contrast to the sophists, who saw truth as relative and dependent on individual perspective, Socrates maintained that objective truths could be discovered through rational discourse. His method of dialectical questioning was designed to challenge assumptions, expose contradictions, and guide participants toward a greater understanding of the ethical principles that govern human behavior. One of the most famous examples of the Socratic method in action comes from Plato's dialogues, such as the Euthyphro, Apology, and Meno. In these dialogues, Socrates engages in conversations with various interlocutors on topics such as piety, justice, and virtue. For example, in the Euthyphro, Socrates questions the definition of piety, repeatedly challenging Euthyphro's assertions until he is left without a satisfactory answer. This relentless questioning exposes the weaknesses in Euthyphro's arguments and demonstrates the limitations of his understanding. In this way, Socrates' method reveals the importance of critical thinking and self-examination in the pursuit of knowledge. A central aspect of the Socratic method is the distinction between knowledge and opinion. Socrates believed that many people operated under the illusion that they knew more than they actually did. He saw this as a major hindrance to true knowledge and wisdom. Through his method, Socrates sought to strip away false beliefs and superficial understandings, guiding individuals toward knowledge that was grounded in reason and logical consistency. This is evident in the Apology, where Socrates defends his role as a philosophical gadfly, claiming that his questioning of the Athenian citizens exposes their ignorance and helps them pursue a more virtuous life. The Socratic method was not limited to abstract discussions of ethics and morality. It was also deeply practical. Socrates used his method to challenge the assumptions that underpinned everyday decisions and behaviors. He often questioned the moral integrity of his fellow citizens, urging them to examine their motivations, values, and actions. In this sense, the Socratic method served not only as a tool for intellectual inquiry, but as a means of promoting moral and ethical growth. Socrates saw philosophy as a way of life, one that demanded constant self-reflection and the courage to question one's own beliefs. Another key element of the Socratic method is its focus on definitions. Socrates believed that clear definitions were essential for any meaningful philosophical discussion. In his dialogues, he would often ask his interlocutors to provide precise definitions of key terms such as justice, virtue, and knowledge. Through this process, Socrates sought to uncover the essential qualities of these concepts and to clarify their meaning. By testing and refining definitions through dialogue, Socrates was able to expose ambiguities and contradictions, thus paving the way for a deeper understanding of abstract concepts. The Socratic method also had a profound impact on the development of logic. While Socrates himself did not formalize logic in the way that Aristotle would later do, his method laid the groundwork for logical reasoning. By systematically questioning premises and examining the relationships between concepts, Socrates fostered a form of critical thinking that would later be formalized into the discipline of logic. His emphasis on clarity, consistency, and reasoning remains central to the practice of philosophy and other disciplines that rely on rational discourse. In conclusion, the Socratic method represents a revolutionary approach to thinking and learning that challenged the intellectual norms of the ancient world. Through his method of dialectical questioning, Socrates sought not to provide answers, but to encourage deep reflection and self-examination. His commitment to intellectual humility, critical inquiry, and ethical growth set him apart from the philosophers of his time. The Socratic method, with its focus on reason, clarity, and logic, continues to be a powerful tool for understanding the world and engaging in meaningful dialogue. It remains a cornerstone of philosophical education and a vital method for exploring the complexities of human life and morality. Socrates' relationship with Athenian democracy was fraught with tension and conflict, as his philosophy often clashed with the prevailing political and social norms of his time. While Athens prided itself on its democratic system, which allowed for broad citizen participation in political decision-making, Socrates maintained a critical stance toward the way democracy functioned in practice. His critiques of democracy were not merely theoretical. They were grounded in his observations of the political and moral shortcomings he saw within Athenian society. This tension between Socrates and democracy came to a head during his trial, where he was charged with impiety and corrupting the youth. Understanding this conflict requires a deeper look at both the nature of Athenian democracy and Socrates' objections to it. Athenian democracy, in its classical form, was a direct democracy where male citizens could participate in the assembly, vote on laws, and serve as jurors in legal cases. This system, introduced in the 5th century BCE, was seen as a revolutionary development in political governance, providing citizens with unprecedented power over their leaders. However, while democratic ideals were central to Athenian political life, Socrates found the execution of these ideals deeply flawed. His objections were primarily centered on the notion that democracy, by giving power to the masses, often resulted in decisions based on ignorance and superficial judgment rather than reason and wisdom. One of Socrates' major concerns with Athenian democracy was its tendency to elevate popular opinion over informed decision-making. In his view, the masses were not always equipped to make wise choices, especially when it came to complex moral and political issues. He believed that many citizens lacked the intellectual tools needed to engage in meaningful deliberation, and as a result, they were easily swayed by rhetoric and demagoguery. In contrast to the ideal of democratic participation, Socrates argued that true knowledge and wisdom should guide political decisions, and that those who made important decisions should be philosophers or individuals who had undergone rigorous intellectual training. He famously compared political leaders who lacked philosophical expertise to blind men leading others through dangerous terrain. Moreover, Socrates was critical of the democratic system's focus on the pursuit of immediate personal gain over the common good. Athenian democracy, in Socrates' view, often rewarded self-interest and short-term success rather than virtue, justice, and long-term welfare. In the Apology, Socrates contrasts his own commitment to truth and virtue with the political practices of his time, noting that the pursuit of fame, power, and wealth often led citizens to make decisions that were detrimental to the state. He argued that a society that values material success and individual gain over moral integrity is bound to deteriorate. Socrates' criticism was not an attack on democracy itself, but on its corruption when governed by popular will rather than by reasoned principles. Socrates' relationship with Athens' democratic leaders was particularly strained. The political system of Athens was not only characterized by public participation, but also by intense factionalism, with competing ideologies and personalities constantly vying for power. Socrates, who regularly engaged in public debate and questioned the prevailing norms of his time, was seen by some as a disruptive force in Athenian society. His association with individuals such as Alcibiades, an aristocrat and military leader who was involved in several controversial political movements, contributed to the perception that Socrates was sympathetic to anti-democratic forces. This connection led some to view him as a threat to the democratic order, especially during the turbulent years following the Peloponnesian War. The trial of Socrates, which resulted in his conviction and death sentence in 399 BCE, can be seen as the culmination of this tension between Socrates and Athenian democracy. He was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens and impiety, charges that were deeply tied to his critical stance on the political and religious norms of his time. Socrates' refusal to conform to the expectations of Athenian society, his questioning of democratic leaders, and his commitment to intellectual inquiry above popular opinion made him a target for those who saw his ideas as dangerous. In the Apology, Socrates defends his practice of questioning and challenging the status quo, arguing that his actions were not subversive, but were aimed at improving the moral character of his fellow citizens. He believed that his role as a philosopher was to encourage people to think critically and to live virtuous lives, even if this meant challenging the prevailing norms of society. Despite his criticisms of democracy, Socrates did not advocate for its overthrow. His objections were not rooted in a desire for oligarchy or tyranny, but were based on his belief that democracy, when unmoored from rational deliberation, could lead to moral and intellectual decay. Socrates' vision of an ideal society was one in which philosophy and reason guided political decision-making, and where rulers were philosophers who sought to understand the true nature of justice and virtue. In this sense, Socrates' critique of Athenian democracy was not a rejection of democracy per se, but rather a call for a more thoughtful, deliberative, and principled approach to governance. The democratic nature of Athens meant that public opinion was a powerful force, and Socrates' disregard for popular sentiment made him a controversial figure. He often engaged in public debates where he questioned the wisdom of respected citizens, which led to resentment and distrust among the Athenian elite. His habit of pointing out the flaws in others' reasoning, often through the use of the Socratic method, earned him the label of a nuisance or even a corrupter of the youth. These public exchanges, while aimed at fostering greater philosophical understanding, were seen by some as a challenge to the authority of the state and its leaders. Socrates' unflinching commitment to truth, even at the cost of his own safety, set him apart from many of his contemporaries who were more willing to conform to the expectations of the state. The trial of Socrates is often viewed as a tragic episode in the history of Athenian democracy. It highlights the tension between intellectual freedom and the collective will of the people. While democracy allowed for a range of opinions to be expressed, it also carried the danger of silencing dissenting voices, particularly those of individuals who challenged the status quo. In this context, Socrates' trial and execution can be seen as a reflection of the inherent conflict between the individual's search for truth and the pressures of societal conformity. Socrates' death, however, also served as a testament to his unwavering commitment to his philosophical principles and his belief in the importance of living a virtuous life. Despite the negative aspects of his relationship with Athenian democracy, Socrates' ideas would ultimately have a profound influence on future democratic systems. His commitment to dialogue, critical inquiry, and the pursuit of knowledge laid the foundation for the development of democratic ideals rooted in rational discourse. Socrates' emphasis on virtue, justice, and the common good continues to resonate in contemporary political thought, reminding us of the importance of philosophical engagement in the practice of democracy. In conclusion, Socrates' critique of Athenian democracy highlights the complexities of his relationship with the political system of his time. His objections to democracy were not a rejection of its core ideals, but a call for a more thoughtful and reasoned approach to governance. Socrates' commitment to intellectual inquiry and moral integrity placed him in opposition to the popular political currents of Athens, leading to his trial and eventual execution. However, his philosophy has endured as a foundational element of democratic thought, underscoring the importance of questioning, deliberation, and virtue in the practice of politics. Socrates' exploration of virtue forms the foundation of much of his philosophical thought, shaping his ethical inquiries and continuing to influence Western philosophy to this day. For Socrates, the concept of virtue was not merely a set of moral rules or a social construct. It was deeply intertwined with the idea of knowledge. He famously argued that virtue is knowledge, implying that a true understanding of what is good leads naturally to virtuous action. This radical position distinguishes Socrates from many of his contemporaries and forms the basis for his ethical theory, which is focused on the moral improvement of the individual through wisdom. At the heart of Socrates' concept of virtue was his belief that it was the ultimate goal of human life. Virtue for Socrates was not simply about living in accordance with societal norms or achieving personal success. It was about aligning one's life with moral and rational principles. He believed that living virtuously was necessary for achieving true happiness or eudaimonia, a concept that is often translated as flourishing or living a fulfilled life. Socrates' view of virtue was holistic. It encompassed all aspects of a person's life, from their moral behavior to their intellectual development and emotional well-being. Socrates rejected the view that virtue was a matter of external achievements or material wealth. He did not see virtue as something that could be measured by one's social status, wealth, or political power, as many of his Athenian contemporaries did. In fact, he was highly critical of those who pursued such things at the expense of moral development. He believed that true virtue could only be found through inner self-examination and philosophical inquiry. In this sense, Socrates positioned himself as a critic of Athenian society, challenging its values and promoting a radically different vision of what it means to live a good life. Socrates believed that knowledge was essential to the cultivation of virtue. This connection between virtue and knowledge was central to his ethical teachings. According to Socrates, the truly virtuous person is one who understands what is good, just, and right. Virtue, in this sense, was not something innate or a matter of external practice. Rather, it was the product of intellectual inquiry and reflection. He argued that if individuals truly understood what was good, they would naturally act in accordance with it. In this way, Socrates reversed the common assumption that people need to practice virtue in order to understand it. Instead, he contended that understanding virtue would lead to virtuous actions. The Socratic view of virtue also involved the idea that all virtues are interconnected. Socrates often discussed virtues like justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom, arguing that they were not separate or independent qualities, but part of a unified whole. For example, he believed that a person who is truly wise will also be just courageous and temperate. These virtues, in Socrates' view, were not isolated traits that could be cultivated separately. Rather, they were aspects of a single, harmonious way of living. This holistic view of virtue emphasizes the idea that a person's character cannot be compartmentalized, and that moral excellence requires the development of all aspects of the self. A key part of Socrates' inquiry into virtue was his commitment to dialogue and the examination of one's beliefs. He often engaged in conversations with individuals about the nature of virtue, asking them to define concepts like justice and courage. Through these conversations, Socrates exposed the contradictions and inconsistencies in their understanding of these concepts, encouraging them to rethink their assumptions. This method, known as the Socratic method, was not only a tool for uncovering knowledge, but also a means of improving moral understanding. Socrates believed that by questioning others, he could help them arrive at a clearer understanding of virtue and inspire them to live more ethical lives. One of Socrates' most important contributions to the concept of virtue was his notion of moral intellectualism. This is the idea that knowledge of the good is necessary for moral behavior. Socrates argued that people do wrong not because they are inherently evil, but because they are ignorant of what is truly good. In this respect, virtue was not about conforming to external rules or customs. Rather, it was about understanding the objective nature of moral truth. Socrates believed that when individuals act immorally, it is because they do not have a clear understanding of the good, and that through proper education and reflection, they could be led to virtuous actions. For Socrates, the most important virtue was wisdom, which he saw as the foundation of all other virtues. Wisdom, in his view, was not simply knowledge of facts or theoretical understanding, but the ability to discern the right course of action in any situation. Socrates valued practical wisdom above theoretical knowledge, as it allowed individuals to navigate the complexities of life in a virtuous way. In the Apology, Socrates claims that he is the wisest man in Athens, not because he has special knowledge, but because he recognizes his own ignorance. This recognition of his lack of knowledge, according to Socrates, is the first step toward true wisdom, as it opens the door to further learning and self-improvement. Socrates' commitment to the idea that virtue is knowledge can also be seen in his attitude toward the soul. For Socrates, the cultivation of virtue was not just a matter of external actions, but of nurturing the soul. He believed that the soul was the seat of moral and intellectual development, and that the goal of life was to care for and improve one's soul through philosophical inquiry and virtuous action. In this way, Socrates offered a vision of ethical living that went beyond mere compliance with laws or social norms, focusing instead on the inner transformation of the individual. He argued that a person who lives a virtuous life is one whose soul is in harmony, and that true happiness comes from cultivating this inner excellence. Socrates' ideas about virtue were revolutionary not only because of their intellectual rigor, but because they challenged the prevailing norms of Athenian society. In a city where power, wealth, and status were often equated with moral worth, Socrates' teachings represented a radical redefinition of what it meant to live a good life. Rather than focusing on external achievements, Socrates placed the emphasis on inner development and self-examination. His refusal to conform to the conventional values of his society and his insistence on the importance of virtue led him to become a deeply controversial figure, but also one of the most influential philosophers in history. In conclusion, Socrates' conception of virtue represents a radical shift in ethical thinking. His emphasis on knowledge as the foundation of virtue, his belief in the interconnectedness of all virtues, and his commitment to the moral improvement of the individual through philosophical inquiry have had a lasting impact on Western philosophy. For Socrates, virtue was not something to be acquired through external action or social status, but something that arose from the cultivation of the soul and the pursuit of wisdom. His teachings on virtue continue to challenge and inspire us to this day, reminding us that the good life is one in which knowledge, wisdom, and moral integrity are at the center. The trial and death of Socrates remain one of the most significant and poignant episodes in the history of Western philosophy. It marked the tragic culmination of his lifelong commitment to philosophical inquiry and his refusal to conform to the societal expectations of his time. Socrates' trial in 399 BCE, his defense during the trial, and his eventual execution by poisoning are not only central events in his life, but also profound moments that raise enduring questions about the nature of justice, the role of the philosopher in society, and the relationship between the individual and the state. To understand the significance of these events, it is essential to explore the circumstances that led to Socrates' trial, the charges brought against him, and the philosophical implications of his defense and death. Socrates was tried in a court of law in Athens, a democracy that valued open discourse but also placed considerable importance on maintaining social order and political stability. The formal charges brought against him were impiety, disrespecting the gods of the city, and corrupting the youth of Athens. These charges were deeply intertwined with Socrates' unorthodox approach to philosophy, his disregard for conventional norms, and his critical stance toward the Athenian political and religious institutions. Socrates' constant questioning of authority, his challenge to the moral and social conventions of Athens, and his association with individuals who were seen as opponents of the democratic system created a context in which he became a target of suspicion and resentment. Socrates' approach to philosophy, characterized by his relentless questioning of widely held beliefs and his refusal to accept conventional wisdom, made him unpopular with many powerful figures in Athens. He was particularly critical of the Sophists, who taught that moral and political truths were relative and subject to individual interpretation. Unlike the Sophists, Socrates believed in the possibility of objective truth and moral certainty. His method of questioning, aimed at exposing the ignorance and contradictions in the beliefs of others, was seen as subversive and disruptive to the social order. His association with figures such as Alcibiades, who had been involved in controversial political movements, further fueled the perception that Socrates was a dangerous influence on Athenian society. The charges against Socrates, though ostensibly related to religious and moral issues, were also deeply political. In the context of post-Peloponnesian War Athens, which had experienced political instability and the collapse of its empire, Socrates' critiques of democracy and his association with anti-democratic individuals were seen as a threat to the city's political order. The idea of Socrates corrupting the youth of Athens reflected the fear that his philosophy might encourage disobedience to the established norms and undermine the authority of the democratic institutions. This tension between Socrates' philosophical independence and the political climate of Athens was a key factor in the trial that led to his death. During the trial, as recorded in Plato's Apology, Socrates defended himself against the charges by arguing that he had not intentionally corrupted the youth, but had instead encouraged them to think critically and examine their own beliefs. He asserted that his philosophical activity, far from being subversive, was in fact beneficial to the city. Socrates argued that his questioning of others was part of a divine mission, given to him by the Oracle of Delphi, to challenge the citizens of Athens to pursue wisdom and virtue. He claimed that his role as a gadfly was essential to the health of the state, likening himself to a horsefly that stimulates a sluggish horse to action. His defense was not one of self-preservation, but of philosophical integrity. Socrates' defense was both rational and impassioned, yet it was also characterized by a sense of irony. Throughout the trial, Socrates remained steadfast in his belief that he was acting in accordance with a higher moral order, even if this meant challenging the social and political norms of Athens. He did not present himself as a humble supplicant begging for mercy, but rather as a philosopher who was committed to the truth, even in the face of death. His refusal to grovel or appeal to the emotions of the jurors further alienated him from those who might have been sympathetic to his case. Socrates' unyielding stance, however, only seemed to strengthen the case for his guilt in the eyes of many of the jurors, who viewed his defiance as evidence of arrogance or impiety. The verdict of the trial was a guilty one, and Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking hemlock, a poisonous plant. The sentencing reflected the tension between the individual's pursuit of truth and the collective will of the democratic state. Socrates, however, did not view his death as a tragedy or as a punishment for his actions. He maintained that his philosophical mission was more important than his life, and he accepted the verdict with calm resignation. In his final moments, Socrates showed no signs of fear or regret. His focus remained on the pursuit of truth, and he saw his death as part of the natural course of his life's work. He believed that the philosopher, having lived a virtuous life, should not fear death, for it was either a peaceful eternal rest or a transition to a better existence. Socrates' final words, as recorded by Plato in the Phaedo, reflect his commitment to philosophy and his belief in the immortality of the soul. Just before drinking the hemlock, Socrates is said to have spoken about the soul's journey after death, expressing his hope that he would continue his philosophical pursuits in the afterlife. His death, therefore, was not a defeat, but a fulfillment of his lifelong commitment to the search for wisdom. For Socrates, death was merely a transition to a different state of existence, and his death did not undermine the validity of his philosophical principles. The trial and death of Socrates have had a lasting impact on philosophy, particularly in the way that they raise questions about the role of the philosopher in society. Socrates' willingness to die for his beliefs established him as a martyr for the cause of intellectual freedom and moral integrity. His death underscores the tension between the pursuit of truth and the demands of society, a theme that continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about the relationship between the individual and the state. Socrates' martyrdom for the sake of philosophy has inspired countless philosophers, from his immediate disciples, like Plato, to later thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw in Socrates an example of intellectual courage and moral fortitude. The philosophical legacy of Socrates' trial and death is immense. In many ways, his death exemplifies the profound commitment that a philosopher must have to their ideas, even in the face of persecution or death. Socrates demonstrated that the pursuit of wisdom and virtue was worth any personal sacrifice, and his unwavering belief in the power of reason and dialogue set a precedent for generations of thinkers who followed. His trial also raises important questions about the nature of justice, the dangers of political power, and the responsibilities of the philosopher to challenge the status quo. Socrates' death, therefore, can be seen not only as a personal tragedy, but as a symbol of the power of philosophy to confront the challenges of society and to endure even in the face of adversity. In conclusion, the trial and death of Socrates represent a pivotal moment in the history of philosophy, highlighting the relationship between the individual and the state, the pursuit of truth, and the moral obligations of the philosopher. Socrates' willingness to die for his beliefs and his steadfast commitment to philosophical integrity have made him a symbol of intellectual courage and moral fortitude. His martyrdom, far from silencing his ideas, helped to ensure their enduring influence on the development of Western philosophy. Through his trial, defense, and death, Socrates demonstrated that the pursuit of knowledge and virtue is not merely an intellectual exercise but a way of life, one that requires sacrifice, courage, and a commitment to truth above all else. Socrates' death, far from marking the end of his intellectual legacy, became the catalyst for the philosophical transformation that would shape the future of Western thought. His teachings, methods, and ideas found their most significant and enduring expression in the works of his student, Plato. Through Plato's dialogues, Socrates was immortalized as a central figure in philosophy, and his influence extended far beyond Athens and the philosophical tradition of his time. Plato, who witnessed the trial and execution of his teacher, became not only the chief recorder of Socratic thought, but also the primary architect of the philosophical system that would dominate Western intellectual history for centuries. Plato's relationship with Socrates was not merely that of a student to a teacher. It was one of profound intellectual partnership. Although Plato developed his own philosophical ideas and often used Socrates as a character in his dialogues, the Socratic method and the emphasis on ethical inquiry remained central to Plato's work. The character of Socrates in Plato's dialogues serves as a model of the ideal philosopher, one who engages in rigorous questioning, seeks the truth above all else, and remains committed to the moral and intellectual improvement of both oneself and society. Plato's portrayal of Socrates helped to preserve and perpetuate the methods and principles that Socrates had championed during his lifetime. Through Plato's writings, Socrates' method of philosophical inquiry, the Socratic method, came to define the way in which philosophy was conducted in the Western tradition. This method, based on systematic questioning and critical examination of beliefs, was a radical departure from the dogmatic approaches to knowledge that characterized much of ancient Greek thought. Socrates, in his conversations with others, would challenge assumptions and force individuals to confront the contradictions in their thinking, ultimately guiding them toward a clearer understanding of the truth. This method emphasized the importance of dialogue, intellectual humility, and the constant pursuit of knowledge, making it an indispensable tool for philosophers in centuries to come. Plato's own philosophical ideas, while deeply rooted in the Socratic tradition, expanded and developed in new directions, often diverging from the thought of his teacher. One of the most significant departures from Socratic philosophy was Plato's theory of forms, which posited that the material world was only a shadow of a higher, unchanging reality. According to Plato, the forms were perfect and eternal ideals, such as the form of the good, the form of justice, and the form of beauty, which could only be apprehended through reason and philosophical contemplation. This theory, which Plato elaborated in works such as the Republic and the Phaedo, was a bold attempt to reconcile the world of appearances with the search for objective truth. For Plato, the philosopher's task was to ascend beyond the world of sensory experience and to seek knowledge of the immutable forms. While Socrates focused on practical ethics and the cultivation of virtue in the individual, Plato's philosophy took on a more metaphysical and systematic character. His theory of the forms provided a foundation for understanding how abstract concepts like justice, beauty, and goodness could be known with certainty, despite their apparent variability in the physical world. However, despite these differences, Plato's work remained firmly grounded in Socratic ideals, particularly in his emphasis on the pursuit of knowledge, the importance of self-examination, and the role of philosophy in achieving a virtuous and fulfilling life. The combination of Socratic method and Platonic metaphysics would form the bedrock of much of Western philosophy, influencing generations of thinkers and shaping philosophical discourse for centuries. Plato's Republic, in particular, is a work that both reflects Socratic thought and develops it in new directions. In the Republic, Socrates serves as the central character, engaging in dialogue with other Athenians to define justice and explore the nature of the ideal city-state. Through this dialogue, Plato not only examines the nature of justice in the individual and the state, but also presents his vision of the philosopher king, a ruler who, guided by wisdom and knowledge of the forms, would lead the ideal society. The Republic is also notable for its exploration of the philosopher's role in society, a theme that echoes Socrates' own belief in the importance of intellectual inquiry and moral leadership. Although Plato's ideal society differs in many ways from the democratic Athens that Socrates critiqued, it can be seen as an attempt to fulfill the Socratic vision of a society guided by reason and virtue. In the Symposium, another of Plato's dialogues, the character of Socrates again plays a central role, this time engaging in discussions about love, beauty, and the nature of the good life. Through his conversations with the other participants, Socrates draws out a vision of love that transcends mere physical attraction and points toward a higher, spiritual love that leads the soul toward the contemplation of the divine. The symposium is emblematic of Plato's method of using Socratic dialogue to explore profound philosophical questions and to illuminate the path to wisdom and virtue. It also highlights the way in which Socratic ideas about ethics and the pursuit of the good were adapted and expanded in Plato's writings. Plato's influence on Western philosophy was not limited to his own time. His works were rediscovered during the Renaissance and played a key role in the development of modern philosophy. The revival of Platonic thought, particularly during the period of Neoplatonism, ensured that Socrates' philosophical legacy endured long after his death. Plato's teachings on ethics, justice, and the nature of reality continued to shape the philosophical landscape, influencing thinkers such as Aristotle, who, despite his differences with Plato, built upon many of the ideas Plato had introduced. Through Plato's works, the spirit of Socratic inquiry and the search for wisdom remained central to philosophical discourse. In addition to his intellectual legacy, Plato's influence also extended to the establishment of formal philosophical institutions, most notably the Academy, which he founded in Athens. The Academy became a center of philosophical inquiry and learning, attracting scholars and students from all over the ancient world. Through the Academy, Plato's ideas, along with those of Socrates, were passed on to future generations of philosophers. The Academy's influence persisted for centuries, becoming one of the most important centers of intellectual life in the ancient world. In conclusion, the relationship between Socrates and Plato is one of the most significant in the history of philosophy. Plato's work preserved and expanded upon Socratic teachings, ensuring that Socrates' ideas would live on long after his death. While Plato developed his own philosophical system, much of his work remains deeply indebted to the Socratic method and the emphasis on dialogue, ethical inquiry, and the pursuit of wisdom. Through Plato's writings, Socrates' influence became foundational to the development of Western philosophy, shaping not only the course of ancient philosophy, but also the intellectual traditions of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and modern thought. Socrates, through the words of Plato, became the model of the philosopher who seeks truth above all else, who questions and challenges accepted wisdom, and who remains committed to the moral and intellectual improvement of the individual and society. Socrates' contributions to the field of ethics and the practice of philosophy have endured for more than 2 millennia, profoundly influencing both ancient and modern thinkers. His legacy is not solely rooted in his method of inquiry or the specifics of his philosophical doctrines, but also in the spirit of intellectual engagement and moral questioning that he embodied. Socrates' refusal to conform to societal norms, his relentless pursuit of truth, and his unwavering commitment to ethical living have made him an enduring figure in the history of thought. His influence transcended his immediate context, shaping the course of ethical theory and philosophical practice in ways that are still felt today. One of Socrates' most important contributions was his conception of ethics, which was grounded in the pursuit of self-knowledge and moral virtue. Unlike many thinkers before him, Socrates believed that the key to living a virtuous life was not the adherence to external rules or societal conventions, but rather the cultivation of wisdom. He famously argued that virtue is knowledge, asserting that if individuals truly understood what is good, they would naturally act in a virtuous manner. This belief was radical for its time, as it shifted the focus of ethics from external observance to internal understanding. By positioning knowledge as the foundation of virtue, Socrates offered a new way of thinking about morality, one that continues to shape contemporary ethical debates. Socrates' emphasis on moral intellectualism, his belief that knowledge of the good leads to virtuous behavior, has had a lasting impact on subsequent ethical theories. In particular, his ideas influenced the development of virtue ethics, a branch of moral philosophy that continues to be prominent today. Virtue ethics, as developed by Aristotle and later by modern philosophers, focuses on the character of the moral agent rather than the rules or consequences of specific actions. This approach to ethics finds its roots in Socratic thought, particularly in Socrates' belief that the cultivation of virtues such as wisdom, courage, and temperance leads to a flourishing life. Socrates' insistence on the importance of intellectual reflection and self-examination as a means of achieving moral growth provided a foundation for ethical systems that emphasize the importance of individual character and personal development. The Socratic method, which Socrates used to engage in philosophical inquiry, has also had a profound and lasting influence. His method of questioning, aimed at challenging assumptions and encouraging critical thinking, has become a cornerstone of philosophical practice. The Socratic method promotes dialogue and self-reflection, encouraging individuals to examine their beliefs and to seek clarity in their understanding. This method, though developed in ancient Greece, continues to be used today in educational settings, particularly in law schools, where it fosters rigorous analytical thinking and an appreciation for the complexities of moral and legal issues. In this sense, Socrates' legacy is not only philosophical, but also educational, as his methods have shaped the way that knowledge is pursued and transmitted. Socrates' influence extends beyond the realm of philosophy and ethics into the broader field of intellectual inquiry. His example has inspired countless thinkers throughout history who have sought to emulate his commitment to the pursuit of truth, his skepticism of conventional wisdom, and his willingness to challenge authority. Figures such as René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, and Friedrich Nietzsche were deeply influenced by Socratic ideas. Descartes, for instance, is often regarded as the philosopher who sought to establish a foundation for knowledge based on doubt, mirroring Socrates' method of questioning and critical examination. Similarly, Kant's emphasis on reason as the guiding principle for moral action can be traced back to Socratic notions of intellectual responsibility and the pursuit of moral truth. Nietzsche, in turn, was inspired by Socrates' critique of societal values. Although he famously challenged Socrates' belief in rationality as the ultimate moral guide, Socrates' legacy is also profoundly political. Although he was critical of Athenian democracy, his ideas about the role of the philosopher in society and the relationship between the individual and the state have shaped political thought for centuries. Socrates believed that the philosopher's role was to challenge the prevailing norms and to encourage individuals to think critically about justice, governance, and the common good. His trial and death, in which he stood firm in his belief that he had acted in accordance with the divine will, serve as a reminder of the tension between intellectual freedom and political authority. Socrates' martyrdom for his beliefs became a symbol of the power of philosophy to question authority and to resist tyranny, influencing political movements throughout history that have sought to protect intellectual freedom and promote justice. In the realm of political philosophy, Socrates' legacy can be seen in the works of later thinkers who were concerned with the nature of the just society and the role of the philosopher in political life. Plato's vision of the philosopher king in the Republic was a direct response to the question of how wisdom and virtue can be integrated into political governance. While Plato's ideal society diverged from Socratic thought in important ways, particularly in its advocacy for rule by a select group of philosopher kings, it continued Socrates' concern with the moral and intellectual responsibilities of rulers. Later political philosophers such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau would engage with these themes, considering how individual rights, justice, and governance intersect. Socrates' belief in the importance of the individual's moral development and his critique of the politics of his day paved the way for these broader discussions about the relationship between individuals and the state. Socrates' emphasis on the importance of the individual's inner life, particularly through his focus on the soul, also resonates with modern existential and psychological thought. The idea that the quest for self-knowledge and personal integrity is the most important pursuit in life has been echoed by existential thinkers such as Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre. Kierkegaard, for example, emphasized the role of individual choice and commitment in creating a meaningful life, echoing Socrates' idea that self-examination is essential to achieving a virtuous and fulfilling existence. Sartre's notion of radical freedom, which stresses the individual's responsibility to define their essence through actions, also resonates with Socratic themes of intellectual autonomy and the need to live authentically according to one's own moral understanding. Furthermore, Socrates' views on ethics and philosophy have influenced the development of modern psychology, particularly in the areas of moral development, and the study of human motivation. The idea that individuals must engage in self-examination and reflection to understand their desires, values, and moral principles is a cornerstone of many psychological approaches. Modern therapeutic practices, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, share similarities with the Socratic method in that they encourage individuals to identify and challenge unexamined beliefs in order to promote personal growth and ethical behavior. In this way, Socrates' influence extends beyond the realm of academic philosophy and into practical fields that aim to improve individuals' lives. In addition to these philosophical and intellectual contributions, Socrates' legacy is also tied to his role as a cultural and moral icon. His steadfastness in the face of death, his refusal to compromise his principles, and his unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth have made him a symbol of intellectual integrity and moral courage. The story of Socrates' trial and death continues to inspire those who are engaged in struggles for justice, human rights, and intellectual freedom. His example remains a powerful reminder of the importance of standing firm in one's beliefs, even when faced with opposition, and of the crucial role that philosophy plays in challenging societal norms and advancing human understanding. In conclusion, Socrates' legacy is one that spans many fields of intellectual inquiry, from ethics and political philosophy to education and psychology. His emphasis on the pursuit of wisdom, the importance of self-examination, and the cultivation of virtue has left an indelible mark on Western thought. The enduring influence of Socrates can be seen in the work of countless philosophers, political thinkers, and educators who have built upon his ideas and methods. Socrates' legacy is not just confined to his own time. It continues to inspire and challenge thinkers around the world, reminding us that philosophy is not merely an abstract pursuit, but a way of life that can guide us toward wisdom, justice, and a deeper understanding of the human condition. The figure of Socrates remains not only a foundational icon in the history of philosophy, but also a living, breathing force in the intellectual, social, and moral discussions of today. His ideas, methodologies, and commitment to ethical living continue to influence modern thought, resonating in a world vastly different from ancient Athens. The Socratic ideal of questioning everything, of constantly seeking the truth, and of striving for personal and societal moral improvement has retained its relevance, particularly as contemporary society faces profound moral, political, and intellectual challenges. In this final chapter, we examine the ongoing impact of Socrates in the modern world, both in philosophy and in everyday life, and explore how his intellectual legacy continues to shape various aspects of contemporary thought. At the heart of Socrates' enduring influence is his emphasis on critical thinking and intellectual humility. In an age where information is readily available and often overwhelming, the ability to think critically and question the validity of received wisdom has never been more important. Socrates' method of questioning, which encourages individuals to confront their assumptions, reflect on their beliefs, and engage in reasoned dialogue, serves as a powerful tool in contemporary education and intellectual discourse. The Socratic method has become a central feature of legal education, where it helps students learn to think analytically, consider multiple perspectives, and weigh the evidence impartially. In a world increasingly characterized by ideological polarization, Socratic questioning offers a model for respectful, productive debate, fostering an environment where ideas are tested, refined, and sometimes even overturned in the search for truth. Socrates' insistence on self-examination and the cultivation of virtue remains a critical aspect of modern ethical thought. In an era where moral relativism and ethical ambiguity often dominate, Socrates' unwavering belief in the existence of objective moral truth stands as a beacon of intellectual and moral clarity. His statement that the unexamined life is not worth living challenges individuals to consider the ethical implications of their actions and decisions, urging them to seek wisdom and integrity in both their personal lives and their interactions with others. Socrates' ethical philosophy, which focuses on the development of virtue and the importance of knowing oneself, continues to resonate with contemporary discussions on personal responsibility, moral character, and the pursuit of happiness. His ideas can be seen in modern debates on the role of ethics in business, politics, and education, where the importance of fostering moral leadership and integrity remains a central concern. In addition to his ethical teachings, Socrates' focus on intellectual humility and the pursuit of knowledge has profound implications for the way we approach science and technology today. Socrates' famous declaration that "I know that I am intelligent, because I know that I know nothing," reflects a deep understanding of the limitations of human knowledge. In an age of rapid technological advancement, where knowledge can sometimes be treated as absolute and infallible, Socrates' reminder of the value of intellectual humility is particularly pertinent. In fields ranging from artificial intelligence to genetic engineering, the importance of recognizing the limits of our knowledge and considering the ethical implications of our discoveries is paramount. Socrates' model of self-awareness and inquiry urges modern thinkers to constantly question the assumptions that underlie scientific and technological progress, ensuring that advancements are made with a sense of moral responsibility and a commitment to the greater good. Socrates' influence is also seen in the development of modern democratic ideals. Although Socrates himself was critical of Athenian democracy, particularly its tendency to allow public opinion to dictate governance, his ideas about the role of the philosopher in society have played a crucial role in shaping democratic theory. Socrates believed that a just society was one where reason and knowledge guided political decisions, and that leaders should be those who possess wisdom and virtue. This vision of enlightened governance can be seen in modern democratic ideals, particularly in the value placed on intellectual competence and moral integrity in public leaders. In the context of modern politics, Socrates' critique of popular opinion and his insistence on moral reasoning challenge us to reconsider the role of the individual in political life and the responsibilities that come with democratic participation. In the realm of education, Socrates' impact remains deeply felt. His belief that education should not simply be the transmission of knowledge, but rather the cultivation of critical thinking and self-reflection, has profoundly influenced modern pedagogical practices. The Socratic method continues to be a cornerstone of modern teaching, particularly in higher education, where it is employed to encourage students to question assumptions, engage in dialogue, and arrive at a deeper understanding of the subject matter. Socratic seminars, in which students engage in open-ended discussions based on critical questioning, are a common practice in many classrooms today. By encouraging students to become active participants in their learning and to approach knowledge with humility and curiosity, Socrates' educational philosophy remains a vital part of contemporary pedagogy. In the world of literature and the arts, Socrates' legacy also endures. His life, his ideas, and his death have inspired countless works of literature, drama, and art. The figure of Socrates has been immortalized in the writings of Plato, Xenophon, and other ancient authors, and his story continues to inspire contemporary thinkers and artists. Socrates' refusal to conform, his challenge to the status quo, and his commitment to intellectual and moral integrity have made him a symbol of resistance and individualism in modern literature and culture. His influence can be seen in the works of writers like Albert Camus, who explored themes of existentialism and the search for meaning in an indifferent world, and in the philosophical dramas of Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, who engage with questions of authenticity, freedom, and the nature of existence. Beyond the academic and artistic realms, Socrates' ideas have influenced popular culture as well. His figure has been embraced by movements that advocate for social change, intellectual freedom, and moral responsibility. The Socratic tradition of questioning authority, examining one's beliefs, and resisting complacency resonates with activists and thinkers who seek to challenge injustices in society. Socrates has become a symbol of the intellectual who stands firm in the face of opposition, advocating for truth, justice, and moral integrity even at great personal cost. His legacy, therefore, extends far beyond the confines of the classroom or the philosopher's study, influencing social movements and political change across the globe. Socrates' life and philosophy also speak to the ongoing relevance of philosophy itself in the modern world. In an era dominated by technology, materialism, and political conflict, philosophy often seems relegated to the periphery of public life. Yet Socrates' unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth and the examination of one's life provides a powerful argument for the continuing importance of philosophy in the modern world. Philosophy, in the Socratic tradition, is not a purely abstract pursuit, but a practical tool for navigating the complexities of life. It is a way of living with integrity, of constantly seeking self-improvement, and of engaging in the moral and intellectual challenges of the world. In this sense, Socrates serves as a reminder that philosophy is not just an academic discipline, but a vital practice that enriches and transforms the lives of those who engage with it. Finally, Socrates' legacy in the modern world offers an invitation for each of us to embrace his ideal of a life dedicated to wisdom, truth, and virtue. The Socratic vision of the examined life challenges us to reflect on our own beliefs, to question our assumptions, and to strive for greater understanding and moral clarity. Socrates reminds us that the pursuit of wisdom is a lifelong endeavor, one that requires intellectual humility, moral courage, and an unwavering commitment to the search for truth. In a world that is often characterized by uncertainty and division, Socrates' example offers a path forward, one of reason, dialogue, and ethical integrity that continues to inspire and guide us today. In conclusion, Socrates' relevance to the modern world is undeniable. His influence extends far beyond the confines of philosophy and continues to shape the intellectual, moral, and political landscape of our time. His ideas about critical thinking, ethical living, and the pursuit of wisdom remain as pertinent today as they were in ancient Athens. Through his enduring legacy, Socrates invites us all to examine our lives, challenge our assumptions, and strive for a deeper understanding of the truth. In doing so, he offers not only a guide for personal growth, but also a model for creating a more just, thoughtful, and virtuous society.